He was a millionaire marked by betrayals and tired of gold-digging women. He gave up his fortune to live in a small apartment with his virgin fiancée to test her. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you're watching. Stay tuned. The rain beat against the bulletproof windows of the penthouse like tears no one wanted to cry. Alexander Raven watched New York City below, a metropolis that seemed too small to contain all the loneliness he carried in his heart. At 34, he had built a technology empire that moved millions, but still woke every morning with the bitter taste of distrust in his mouth. His office occupied the top floor of a mirrored building on Wall Street where executives chased. Dreams that Alexander had already achieved and discovered were empty. His secretary, an efficient middle-aged woman, knocked on the door and entered with a folder of documents about the company's social project. It was something he maintained more for tax purposes than out of kindness, but today it would change his life forever. Mr. Raven, I need your signature for the sponsorship of the community college prep program in South Bronx. It's a small amount, but they insist on a visit from you to learn about the project, she said, adjusting her glasses. Alexander sighed. Social visits were part of the corporate theater he detested, but knew was necessary. Schedule it for tomorrow morning. The sooner, the better, he replied, without taking his eyes off the window. The secretary hesitated for a moment, as if wanting to say something, but merely nodded and left, allowing silence to waltz through the room like a familiar ghost. That night, Alexander dined alone at the mahogany table that could seat 12, served by a housekeeper who barely dared look him in the eyes. The mansion where he lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a mausoleum of marble and solitude, each room echoing memories of a childhood he preferred to forget. It was there his father had withered away after the scandal. There he had found the note that became his life philosophy. He went upstairs to his bedroom, where a king-sized bed awaited him like a cold island amid an ocean of Persian rugs. He opened the safe embedded in the wall and removed an envelope yellowed with time. Inside was his father's note, written in the trembling handwriting of someone who had already given up on living. Love doesn't exist. It's just power in disguise. The words seemed to pulse on the paper like a curse he had inherited along with the fortune. Alexander folded the note and put it away again, as he did every night for 15 years. He lay on the bed and closed his eyes, trying to push away memories of his mother who had abandoned them for another man, taking with her not only his father's heart, but also any hope Alexander might have had about true love. The following morning, he drove his BMW through New York's congested streets, crossing the city like someone traversing different worlds. The South Bronx was light years away from his reality, a place where dreams cost more because they were more rare. The college prep program operated in a simple building with walls that were once white and now bore the marks of time and daily struggle. The director, a woman in her 50s with grey hair tied in a bun, greeted him with a genuine smile that made him uncomfortable. "Mr. Raven, what an honor to have you here. Our students are eager to meet you." She led him through narrow corridors where young people studied at old desks, but with a determination he had lost long ago. That's when he saw her. Claire was standing in front of a blackboard, explaining literature to a class of teenagers who looked at her as if she could transform words into bridges to a better future. She wore a light blue dress that contrasted with her loose brown hair, and when she smiled at the students, Alexander felt something strange move in his chest, as if a dead part of him had just awakened. "This is Claire, our literature teacher," said the director, and Alexander realized he had stopped walking, hypnotized by the way she moved her hands while talking about dreams and poetry. "Claire, this is Mr. Alexander Raven from Raven Tech, our sponsor." Claire turned to him and their eyes met. They were brown eyes, deep, that seemed capable of reading through the masks he wore every day. For a moment, Alexander forgot who he was, where he was, all the armor he had built around his heart. She smiled, a gentle smile that had something of the sunset in it, and extended her hand. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Raven. Thank you for believing in our students." Her voice was melodious, carrying a sincerity he hadn't heard in years. When their hands touched, Alexander felt an electric current run through his entire body, as if he were being introduced not just to a woman, but to a possibility of redemption he didn't even know he was looking for. During the days that followed, Alexander found himself thinking about Claire more than he would like to admit. He would return from work to the empty mansion and remember the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about literature, the way her students leaned forward in their desks when she explained a poem, as if words were seeds capable of sprouting hope even there, in that place forgotten by luck. He began finding excuses to visit the program. Sometimes he needed to monitor the project's progress. Other times, he wanted to better understand the work being done. The director was flattered by the interest, but Alexander knew he was lying to himself. He wanted to see Claire, hear her voice, perhaps understand why she made him feel like a teenager discovering there is something beyond the cold logic of business. Claire, for her part, seemed not to notice his frequent visits, or pretended not to notice. She always greeted him with the same polite cordiality, asked about his work, thanked him for the support, but maintained a respectful distance that intrigued him even more. There was something about her that Alexander couldn't decipher, an old sadness that lived in the depths of her eyes, as if she carried a weight no one else could see. On a Thursday afternoon, he arrived at the program and found Claire in the teacher's room alone, grading tests. She was sitting in a plastic chair with stacks of paper spread over a small table and was biting her lower lip as she read the students' answers. Alexander knocked on the door and entered, feeling his heart race as if he were a boy asking to dance at the school party. "Sorry to bother you. May I come in?" She raised her eyes and smiled, gesturing for him to sit in the chair beside her. "Of course, Mr. Raven. I was just finishing the grading. Some students wrote beautiful essays about dreams and future prospects." Alexander sat down, noticing how close he was to her, able to smell the subtle perfume she wore, something floral and delicate that matched her personality. "It must be rewarding to see their progress," he said, trying to sound casual, but his eyes couldn't look away from her face. "It's the most beautiful part of my job," Claire replied, and Alexander noticed how her voice became softer when she spoke about the students. "Sometimes I think they teach me more than I teach them, about courage, about not giving up even when everything seems impossible." There was something in the way she spoke that made Alexander want to know more about her, about what had brought her there, about the dreams she herself carried. "And you, Claire, what are your dreams?" The question came out more intimate than he intended, and he saw a shadow pass through her eyes before she smiled again. "I dream of simple things," she said, lowering her gaze to the tests. "A peaceful life, being able to help more people, maybe having a family someday." Alexander noticed that she had hesitated before mentioning family, as if that dream were more complicated than it seemed. "You don't have a boyfriend?" The question escaped before he could control himself, and Claire looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret. Was it surprise, shyness, or something deeper? "No," she answered simply, but Alexander noticed her hands trembled slightly as she organized the papers. "And you? You must have someone special, a successful man like yourself." Alexander laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "No, I guess I haven't found the right person yet." He paused, gathering courage to say what he really thought. "Or maybe I'm afraid to find her." Claire looked at him attentively, and Alexander had the impression she was seeing through him, reading the fears he hid behind the expensive suit and confident posture. "Why afraid?" she asked, and there was a gentleness in the question that made him want to answer honestly. "Because when you have a lot to lose, it's easier not to bet," he said, surprising himself with his own sincerity. "My father always said that love was a dangerous illusion." Claire was silent for a moment, and Alexander saw that she was thinking carefully before responding. "I think your father was afraid too," she finally said. "Maybe he had suffered so much that he preferred to believe love doesn't exist, rather than admit it just didn't work out for him." Her words hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach. No one had ever spoken about his father that way, with that combination of understanding and courage. "You're very wise for someone so young," he said, and saw Claire blush slightly. "I'm not that young," she replied, and Alexander noticed there was something melancholic in the way she said it. Sometimes life teaches us things we didn't want to learn. They sat in silence, a comfortable silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Alexander felt he could stay there forever, just looking at Claire, trying to decipher the mysteries she carried, as if they were treasures kept in a secret safe. "Claire," he said, and she raised her eyes to him. "Would you like to have dinner?" "With me tomorrow?" "Nothing formal, just talk a little more." He saw the hesitation in her eyes, as if an internal battle was being fought. "I don't know if it's appropriate," she said. But Alexander could tell she wanted to say yes. "You're the program's sponsor and I—" "Forget that I'm a sponsor," he interrupted. "I'm just a man who would like to get to know an interesting woman better." Claire bit her lower lip again, and Alexander felt like kissing her right there, in the middle of that small, simple room. "All right," she finally said, "but somewhere simple, please." Alexander smiled, a genuine smile he hadn't given in years. "I know the perfect place." The restaurant Alexander chose was in the village, a cozy place with wooden tables and yellowish lights that created an intimate atmosphere without being ostentatious. He had arrived 15 minutes early and felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When Claire appeared at the door wearing a dark green dress that enhanced her eyes, Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. She walked with a natural elegance that didn't come from etiquette classes or expensive salons, but from something internal, a quiet confidence that made her magnetic. When she approached the table, Alexander stood up to pull out the chair for her and smelled the subtle perfume he had already memorized without realizing it. "Thank you," she said, sitting down carefully, and Alexander noticed her hands trembled slightly when she picked up the menu. "The place is beautiful, very cozy. I thought you might like something more private," he replied, sitting across from her, away from curious eyes at the program. Claire smiled, but Alexander noticed there was tension in her shoulders, as if she were preparing for something difficult. They talked about trivialities at first, about work, about the students in the program, about the city that surrounded them with its brutal contrasts. But as the night progressed and the wine relaxed their defenses, the conversation became deeper, more personal. Alexander discovered that Claire had lost her parents when she was young, that she lived alone in a small apartment in Brooklyn, that she read poetry every night before sleeping. "And you, Alexander?" she asked, and he noticed she had stopped, calling him Mr. Raven. "What was your childhood like? It must have been very different from mine." Alexander hesitated, holding the wine glass between his fingers. He didn't usually talk about the past, but there was something about Claire that made him want to be honest. "Not as different as you might imagine," he finally said. "I had everything money could buy, but I didn't have what really mattered." What really mattered? Claire leaned slightly forward, and Alexander saw genuine interest in her eyes, not the morbid curiosity people usually showed when the subject was his family. Emotional stability, parents who loved each other, the feeling that home was a safe place. He paused, surprised by his own openness. "My mother abandoned us when I was 14, ran off with another man, an artist with no money, turned our family into newspaper headlines." Claire reached across the table and lightly touched his fingers. The touch was brief, but Alexander felt an electric current run through his entire body. "I'm sorry," she said, and there was so much sincerity in her voice that he almost forgot to breathe. "My father never recovered. Spent years withering away until one day he simply gave up." Alexander didn't mention the suicide, but Claire seemed to understand there was more to the story. "He left me a lesson about love that I carry to this day." "What lesson?" she asked, and Alexander saw that she had interlaced her fingers as if preparing to hear something painful. "That love doesn't exist. That it's just power in disguise, a way for one human being to control another." The words came out bitter, laden with years of pain and distrust. "That all women are capable of betrayal if they find something better." Claire withdrew her hand from the table and placed it in her lap, and Alexander immediately regretted having spoken. He saw something close in her eyes, as if a door had been locked. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, and there was a fragility in the question that made him want to take back everything he had said. "I wish I didn't believe it," he answered, being honest. Especially now. Claire looked at him attentively, and Alexander felt he was on a precipice about to say something that would change everything between them. Why especially now? Her voice was almost a whisper, and Alexander realized she already knew the answer, that she was just waiting for him to have the courage to say it. "Because I met you," he said, and saw her eyes fill with tears. "And for the first time in my life, I want to believe my father was wrong." Claire lowered her gaze, and Alexander saw a tear roll down her face. "You shouldn't place so much hope in me," she said, and there was a deep sadness in her voice. "I'm not who you think I am." "Who are you then?" he asked, feeling his heart race. There was something in the way she spoke that put him on alert, as if she were trying to create distance between them. "I'm just a college prep teacher who had an ordinary life," she said, but Alexander noticed she couldn't look him in the eyes. "I'm not special, I'm not pure, I'm not anything that deserves to be idealized." Alexander stood up and walked around the table, sitting in the chair next to her. "Claire, look at me," he said, and when she raised her eyes, he saw fear there. "I'm not idealizing you, I'm falling in love with you." The words came out before he could control himself, and the silence that followed was deafening. Claire looked at him as if he had just confessed to a crime, and Alexander felt he had made an irreparable mistake. "You don't know me," she finally said, her voice trembling. "If you did, you wouldn't say that." "Then let me get to know you," he replied, taking her hand in his. "Let me know all your secrets, all your scars. Let me love you completely." Claire stood up abruptly, grabbing her purse. "I need to go," she said, and Alexander saw panic in her eyes. "This was a mistake. I shouldn't have come." "Claire, wait," he said, standing up too, but she was already walking toward the door. Alexander followed her, leaving money on the table without even looking at the amount. "Please don't leave like this." On the sidewalk, under the light of the village street lamps, Claire turned to him. Her eyes were full of tears, and Alexander felt his heart break. "I can't, Alexander," she said. "I wish I could, but I can't. You deserve someone better." "I don't want someone better," he replied, approaching slowly. "I want you." Claire closed her eyes, and Alexander saw a battle being fought within her. When she opened her eyes again, there was a sad determination there. "Good night, Alexander," she said, and began walking toward the bus stop. Alexander stood on the sidewalk, watching her walk away, feeling that something important was slipping through his fingers. For the first time in his life, he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, had confessed his feelings, and she had run away. But instead of anger, he felt only a growing certainty. Claire was running not from him, but from something inside herself. And he wouldn't give up until he discovered what it was. The days that followed were a silent torture for Alexander. He returned to the program twice, but Claire seemed to have become a ghost, always busy, always somewhere he wasn't. When he finally found her in the teacher's room, she greeted him with an icy politeness that made him feel as if he had dreamed all the closeness they had shared. "Good morning, Mr. Raven," she said, returning to the formal treatment as if building a barrier between them. "How can I help you?" Alexander felt the words die in his throat. He had rehearsed a speech, an explanation, an apology, but faced with Claire's controlled coldness, everything seemed useless. "I just wanted to know how you were," he said, and hated how small and insecure his voice sounded. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, without raising her eyes from the papers she was organizing. "If you don't need anything else related to the project, I have a class in 5 minutes." Alexander remained there for a few seconds, observing her, trying to find some trace of the woman who had cried in front of him at the restaurant. But Claire had locked herself behind walls he didn't know how to scale. "Of course, Dad," he finally said. "I don't want to disturb your work." When he left the room, Alexander felt he was losing a war he didn't even know he was fighting. He drove back to the office with a heavy heart, but instead of giving up, a strange determination grew inside him. There was something about Claire that made her run away, something she hid so carefully that she was willing to give up any possibility of happiness. In the following days, Alexander became a detective of his own obsession. He hired a private investigator, something he would normally do to protect his business. but now used to understand the woman who had become his constant thought. The report arrived in a week, and the information was surprisingly sparse. Claire Sanders, 28 years old, native of Newark, graduated in literature from Columbia with a full scholarship. She lived alone in a rented apartment in Brooklyn, had no criminal record, few social networks, a discreet life, but there were gaps in the story, periods when she had disappeared from the records, as if she had made herself invisible by choice. The investigator had attached photos of her leaving the apartment, going to work, shopping at the local market. In one of the photos, she was sitting on a park bench holding a silver chain with a butterfly pendant, looking at the horizon with an expression of deep melancholy. Alexander studied that photo for hours, trying to decipher what was behind that sadness. It was then that he decided to take a radical action. If Claire didn't want to talk to Alexander Raven, the millionaire businessman, perhaps she would talk to Alexander, the common man. The idea that sprouted in his mind was crazy, dangerous, but it was also the only way he saw to break the barriers she had built. That night, Alexander was in the office until late, developing a plan that would change not only his life, but his identity. He called his personal lawyer and requested the creation of an alternative identity, documents that would allow him to live as a common man without the weight of the Raven surname. "Is this for a specific project?" asked the lawyer, and Alexander realized his request sounded strange, even to someone accustomed to the whims of the rich. "It's personal," Alexander replied. "I need a clean identity with no connections to the company or my family. Alexander Smith, 34 years old, computer, science teacher. Can you arrange that?" The lawyer hesitated. "I can, but it's risky. If they find out—" "They won't find out," interrupted Alexander. "And I need a small, simple apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, nothing that draws attention." 4. A week, Alexander organized his new life. He bought simple clothes, studied how to behave like a middle-class man, rehearsed a plausible story about his past. He would be a computer science teacher newly arrived in the city, divorced with no family. Simple, common, harmless. The apartment he rented was in Brooklyn, a few blocks from Claire's home. It was small, with 2 bedrooms, an American kitchen, and a living room that smelled of fresh paint. Alexander moved in taking only the essentials, storing his expensive suits and luxury watches in a private storage unit. On the first morning in his new identity, Alexander looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. He wore jeans, a plain dress shirt and sneakers, hair slightly disheveled. He looked vulnerable, human, real. For the first time in years, there was nothing in his appearance that screamed power or money. The plan was simple: create casual situations. To meet Claire, get to know her as Alexander Smith. Win her trust. If she loved him without knowing who he really was, then perhaps there was hope. If he discovered he was in love with a person who only existed in his fantasy, at least he would know the truth. But when he left the apartment that morning, Alexander had no idea that Claire already carried secrets that would make his plan a dangerous game, with feelings that neither of them knew how to control. He walked through the streets of Brooklyn, observing the neighborhood that would be his temporary new home. Simple houses, small businesses, people rushing to work without the weight of million-dollar decisions on their shoulders. It was a different world, slower, more human. A world where perhaps it would be possible to discover if Claire Sanders could love Alexander Smith. He stopped at a bakery on the corner and ordered a simple coffee, watching the street traffic. Somewhere nearby, Claire was waking up, preparing for another day of work, not knowing that her life was about to become complicated in ways she could never imagine. Alexander drank the coffee, feeling the bitter taste in his mouth, and wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life or if he had finally found the courage to fight for what he wanted. There was only one way to find out. And Alexander Smith was ready to get to know Claire Sanders for real. The first casual meeting was planned with the precision of a military operation. Alexander discovered that Claire frequented a small bookstore in downtown Brooklyn every Tuesday, right after work. He arrived there 15 minutes before her, pretending to look for a book on programming, when he saw her enter. Claire wore a light yellow dress that made her look like a ray of sunshine amid the dusty books. She walked directly to the literature section. With the familiarity of someone who knows every shelf, every corner of that place, Alexander waited a few minutes before approaching, feigning casualness. "Excuse me," he said, and Claire turned, surprised. "Aren't you the teacher from the South Bronx College prep program? I saw you there last week when I was delivering some equipment." Claire looked at him attentively, and Alexander felt his heart race. She didn't recognize him as Alexander Raven, but there was something in her eyes that suggested familiarity. "Yes, I teach there," she replied, guarded. "Do you work with technology?" "Computer science," he said, extending his hand. "Alexander Smith. I work as a freelancer, configuring computers, that sort of thing. Sometimes I do services for schools and college prep programs." When she shook his hand, Alexander felt the same electric current as before, but now there was something different. Claire didn't immediately withdraw her hand, didn't erect barriers. She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Claire Sanders," she said. "Nice to meet you." "The pleasure is mine," replied Alexander, and realized he was being honest. Meeting Claire this way, without the weight of his identity, was like seeing her for the first time. "Do you come here often?" "I just moved to the neighborhood and I'm exploring places." "Every Tuesday," she replied, relaxing slightly. "It's one of my favorite places in the city. It has books you can't find anywhere else." Alexander looked around, feigning interest. "It really does seem special. Could you recommend something? I don't read much, but I'd like to start." Claire hesitated for a moment, then walked to a nearby shelf. "It depends on what you like," she said, running her fingers over the books as if caressing old friends. "Fiction, non-fiction, poetry?" "I don't know," replied Alexander, and for the first time he was being completely honest. "Maybe you can teach me to like literature." Claire looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret. "Literature isn't something you learn to like," she said. "It's something you discover was already inside you, waiting for the right words to awaken it." Her words touched something deep in Alexander. "Then maybe I need the right words," he said, and saw something move in her eyes, a softness he had seen only once before. Claire picked up a thin book with a blue cover. "Start with this," she said, handing him the book. "It's poetry, but poetry that speaks about real feelings, about love, about loss, about new beginnings." Alexander looked at the cover and saw it was a collection of poems by Pablo Neruda. "Thank you," he said, and their voices brushed when she passed the book. "Maybe you could explain some parts to me. I don't understand much about poetry." Claire smiled, and Alexander realized it was the first time she had truly smiled at him. "Poetry isn't meant to be understood," she said. "It's meant to be felt. But if you want to talk about the poems, I'd be happy to help." "How about we have coffee next week?" asked Alexander, trying to sound casual. "After I've read some poems." Claire hesitated again, but this time the hesitation was different. It was shyness, not fear. "All right," she said. "Friday after work there's a small coffee shop nearby." "Perfect," replied Alexander, feeling a small but significant victory. "Friday it is then." When he left the bookstore, Alexander held the book against his chest and felt something strange. For the first time in years, he was genuinely excited to read. Not because he needed to impress Claire, but because she had touched the book, had chosen those words specifically for him. That night, in the small apartment that smelled of fresh paint, Alexander opened Neruda's book and began to read. The poem spoke of passion, of impossible love, of the pain of loving someone you cannot have. Each verse seemed written for him. Each word echoed his own feelings. "I love you without knowing how or when or where," he read aloud, and the words seemed to come alive in the air. This was exactly how he felt about Claire, a love that had been born from nowhere and grown until it became the most important thing in his life. During the following days, Alexander dedicated himself to living as Alexander Smith. He bought simple clothes, learned to cook basic dishes, discovered what it was like to take the bus, shop at the local market. It was strange, but also liberating. For the first time, no one looked at him with expectation or interest. No one wanted anything from him besides his presence. He read Neruda's book 3 times, marking verses that touched him, preparing for the conversation with Claire. But he also discovered that he was reading because he genuinely enjoyed it, because the words spoke to a part of him that had been dormant for years. On Friday, he arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes before the scheduled time, nervous as if it were a first date. And in a way it was. This time it wasn't Alexander Raven, the millionaire businessman, trying to impress a teacher. It was Alexander Smith, an ordinary man, hoping to talk with a woman who intrigued him. When Claire entered the coffee shop, Alexander stood to greet her. She wore a simple dress, navy blue, and carried a small purse. She seemed more relaxed, closer, more real. "Hello," she said, sitting at the small table near the window. "Did you manage to read some poems?" "All of them," replied Alexander, and saw surprise in her eyes. "I couldn't stop. You were right. You don't need to understand. Just feel." Claire smiled, a true smile that illuminated her entire face. "Which was your favorite?" Alexander opened the book to a page he had marked. "This one," he said, and began to read. "Love is so short, forgetting is so long." He paused and looked at her. "It made me think about how much time we waste being afraid to love." Claire was silent, and Alexander saw that his words had touched something deep within her. "Sometimes," she said softly, "fear exists for a reason. Sometimes protecting your heart is more important than risking breaking it." "But if we never risk," replied Alexander, "we'll never know what we're capable of. We'll never know if love is worth it." Claire looked at him with an intensity that left him breathless. "And do you think it is?" "I'm starting to believe it is," he said, and this time he was being completely honest. "Especially when we find someone who makes us want to be a better person." His words hung in the air like a confession, and Alexander saw that Claire was fighting something internally. She wanted to believe, wanted to trust, but there was something holding her back. The weeks that followed were the most intense of Alexander's life. He and Claire began meeting regularly, always in simple places: the coffee shop, the bookstore, a nearby park where they walked among the trees while talking about books, dreams, and life philosophy. For the first time, Alexander was getting to know a woman for real, without games, without interests, just two people discovering each other. Claire was different with Alexander Smith. More open, more spontaneous, more herself. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm when she wanted to emphasize something, let him hold her hand when they walked. But Alexander noticed that she still carried secrets, shadows that passed through her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. On a Sunday afternoon, they were sitting in the park, Claire reading a poem aloud while Alexander watched her. Her voice was melodious, each word laden with emotion, and he found himself thinking how foolish he had been to try to test her when he could simply have fallen in love with her from the beginning. "Alexander," she said, closing the book and looking at him, "can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course," he replied, feeling his heart race. There was something in the way she spoke that put him on alert. "Have you been married? Do you have children?" The question came loaded with a tension he didn't fully understand. "No," he replied, being honest. "I never found someone I wanted to build a family with. And you?" Claire lowered her gaze, and Alexander saw her hands tremble slightly. It's complicated," she said, and there was so much pain in her voice that he felt like hugging her. "Sometimes life presents us with situations we don't know how to handle." Alexander leaned closer to her. "You can talk to me about anything. Claire, I won't judge you." She looked at him with eyes full of tears. "You're a good person, Alexander. Very good. Sometimes I feel guilty for being here with you." "Why?" he asked, genuinely confused. "You have nothing to feel guilty about." "Yes, I do," she said, and a tear rolled down her face. "You don't know who I really am. If you knew—" Alexander took her face in his hands, wiping the tear with his thumb. "I know you're an amazing woman who dedicates her life to teaching young people, who has a generous heart and a beautiful soul. That's all I need to know." Claire closed her eyes, giving in to his touch. "I wish it were that simple," she whispered. "That Afternoon, Alexander walked her home for the first time. Her apartment was small but cozy, full of books and plants. There were photographs on the walls, but Alexander noticed there were no photos of her with a man, no family photos. It was as if she had appeared in the world alone. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, and Alexander accepted, more interested in spending more time with her than in the drink. While she prepared coffee in the small kitchen, Alexander observed the living room. This was where she lived, where she dreamed, where she cried, when she thought no one was watching. There was an honest simplicity to the place that contrasted with the empty luxury of his mansion. "Are you happy here?" he asked when she returned with the cups. Claire sat next to him on the simple sofa. "I am," she said, and Alexander realized she was being sincere. "For the first time in a long time, I am happy." "For the first time?" Alexander turned to her, intrigued. "Did you go through difficult times?" Claire nodded, looking at the cup in her hands. "We all do, don't we? Some more than others." Alexander felt she was about to open up, to tell the secrets she carried. "You can trust me," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Claire looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude and fear. "Do you promise you won't judge me? That you won't run away when you know the truth?" "I promise," said Alexander, and at that moment he truly meant it. "No matter what it is, it won't change what I feel for you." Claire took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "When I was 18, she began, her voice trembling, "something terrible happened to me, something that changed my life forever." Alexander took her hand, encouraging her to continue. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," he said, but Claire shook her head. "I need to," she said. "If we're going to have any chance, you need to know." She paused, and Alexander saw she was fighting back tears. I was raped." The words fell like bombs in the silence of the room. Alexander felt his breath catch, not for the confession itself, but for the pain he saw in her eyes. "Claire," he whispered, squeezing her hand. "He was a powerful man," she continued, the words tumbling out now that she had started. "A politician. He told me no one would believe me, that I was just a poor girl trying to take advantage of him." Alexander felt anger growing inside him, an anger that wanted to find this man and deliver justice with his own hands. "Did you report it?" "I tried," said Claire, and now the tears were flowing freely. "But you know how it is. Powerful men, poor girls. The story repeated itself as it always does." Alexander pulled her into his arms, and Claire nestled against his chest, trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry you went through that." "There's more," she said, and Alexander felt the worst was yet to come. "I had a baby, a boy." Alexander pulled back slightly to look at her. "You have a son?" "No," she said, and the pain in her voice was unbearable. "I gave him to my sister to raise. He's registered as her son, not mine. I couldn't look at him without remembering." She didn't finish the sentence, but Alexander understood. "Where is he now?" he asked, trying to process everything he was hearing. "He lives with my sister in Atlantic City. He doesn't know I'm his mother. He thinks I'm just his aunt. It's better that way." Alexander held her face again. "Claire, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You were a victim. You did nothing wrong." "But I feel like I did," she said. "For years I felt like it was my fault, as if I had somehow provoked it." "It wasn't your fault," said Alexander, with a firmness that made her look into his eyes. "It was never your fault." Claire leaned against him again, and they remained silent for a few minutes. Alexander felt the weight of her secrets, but also felt something more, an even deeper love, a need to protect her, to show that not all men were monsters. "Do you still want me near you?" she asked, her voice small and insecure. Alexander kissed her on the forehead, on the eyes, on the tear-wet cheeks. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he had said it as Alexander Smith. "I love you even more now." Claire began to cry harder, but this time they were tears of relief. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love you so much it scares me." That night they made love for the first time. It was gentle, careful, full of affection and patience. Claire trembled in his arms, and Alexander understood that each touch was an act of courage for her. He kissed her as one kisses something sacred, loved her as one tries to heal old wounds with tenderness. When they fell asleep embracing, Alexander thought he had found true happiness. But he didn't know that Claire's secrets hadn't ended, and that his own secrets were about to transform that love into something much more complicated and dangerous than he imagined. For 3 months, Alexander and Claire experienced a happiness that neither had known before. He maintained his double routine. During the day, he managed his business empire remotely, using codes and intermediaries so no one would suspect his absence. At night, he returned to the simple Brooklyn apartment, to Claire's arms and to a life that finally made sense. Claire had blossomed like a flower that finally found the sun. She smiled more, talked about future plans, let Alexander touch her without fear. They cooked together, read poetry in bed, made love with an intensity that grew each day. Alexander discovered it was possible to be happy with little, that the luxury that had always surrounded him was nothing but a golden prison. But secrets have a life of their own, and Alexander's began to weigh more each day. Especially when Claire talked about the future, about simple dreams she wanted to realize by his side. She wanted him to meet her students, to go to school parties, to be a real part of her life. "You're different," Claire said one Sunday morning while preparing coffee. "More distant. Is something worrying you?" Alexander was sitting at the small table watching her. She wore a simple nightgown, her hair loose, and was so beautiful that he felt his heart ache. "Just work," he lied, hating himself for it. "You work a lot," she said, approaching and massaging his shoulders. "Sometimes I wonder if you're not hiding something." The phrase made him freeze. "Why do you say that?" Claire laughed, but Alexander noticed there was something studied in the laugh. "My paranoia. Sometimes you leave for work and take hours to return, and there are days when you seem like another person, as if you were acting." Alexander stood up and kissed her, more to avoid, answering than out of desire. "You're imagining things," he said, but he felt she wasn't convinced. That afternoon, while Claire was teaching, Alexander received a call that would change everything. It was his lawyer, with news that left him cold. "Alexander, I need to see you urgently," said the man, his voice tense. "Someone is investigating your false identity. Someone found out about Alexander Smith." Alexander felt the world spin. "Who?" "We don't know yet, but the investigation is professional. Whoever it is, they have resources and are being very discreet." Alexander hung up the phone with trembling hands. Someone was hunting his secrets, and if they discovered about Claire, about what he was doing, everything would become public. The scandal would destroy not only his career, but also her life. That night, Claire noticed something was wrong. Alexander was tense, distant, answering her questions with monosyllables. After dinner, she sat next to him on the sofa and took his hand. "Talk to me," she said. "What's happening?" Alexander looked at her and saw so much love in her eyes that he almost confessed everything, almost told her who he really was, almost explained about the test, about the need to be sure. But then he imagined the look of betrayal on her face, imagined how she would feel knowing she had been deceived for months. "Nothing," he said. "I'm just tired." Claire studied him for a moment, then stood up. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, and Alexander realized she didn't believe him. While listening to the sound of water, Alexander made a decision. He could no longer sustain the lie, but he also couldn't tell the truth, at least not yet. He needed time to think, to find a way to explain without losing Claire. That night they made love for the last time without either of them knowing it. It was different, charged with an urgency neither understood. Claire cried afterward for no apparent reason, and Alexander held her as if she might slip through his fingers. "I love you," she said, and there was a hopelessness in her voice that frightened him. "No matter what happens, I love you." "I love you too," he replied, and it was true. He loved her more than he had loved anything in life. "I will always love you." The next day, Alexander returned to the office for the first time in weeks. He needed to understand who was investigating his identity, needed to control the situation before it exploded. But when he arrived, he discovered it was too late. His secretary was waiting with a somber expression. "Mr. Raven," she said, "someone is here who needs to speak with you, says it's about an urgent personal matter." Alexander entered the room and found a man in a dark suit with a folder in his hands. "Mr. Raven," said the man, "my name is Dr. Henry Morgan. I'm an attorney." The name was familiar, but Alexander couldn't remember where he knew it from. "How can I help you?" "I represent a client who has an interest in certain information about your recent personal life, specifically about your identity as Alexander Smith." Alexander felt his blood freeze. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My client knows about your Brooklyn apartment, about your teacher girlfriend, about your little social experiment. He is willing to keep this information confidential in exchange for a favor." "What favor?" asked Alexander, but he already knew. He wouldn't like the answer. "My client needs you to convince Claire Sanders not to attend certain hearings that are being organized. He needs her to give up trying to reopen an old case." It was then that Alexander understood. The man who had raped Claire was back and somehow had discovered about them. He was using Alexander as a weapon to silence Claire again. "You can give a message to your client," said Alexander, his voice icy. "He can go to hell." The man stood up, putting away the folder. "What a pity," he said. "I hope Miss Sanders is prepared to see her personal life exposed in the newspapers, especially the part about you two." Alexander stood up too, fists clenched. "If you touch her—" "We won't touch," said the man, walking toward the door. "We'll just tell the truth about how a millionaire businessman created a false identity to get close to a humble teacher, about how he deceived her, manipulated her, used her for his psychological games." Alexander knew the man was right. Even if his intentions were good, even if he had truly fallen in love, the story would seem sordid when exposed. Claire would feel betrayed, humiliated, used. "You have 48 hours, said the man before leaving. "After that, the story goes to the newspapers." Alexander was left alone in the office, looking at the city below. He had achieved what he wanted, the certainty that Claire loved him for who he was, not for what he had. But now that certainty would become the weapon that would destroy her. That night, he returned to the Brooklyn apartment with a broken heart. Claire was waiting with dinner ready, wearing the blue dress he liked so much. When she smiled at him, Alexander knew he couldn't protect her. Someone would always get hurt, and he would have to choose between his love and her safety. But Claire had also received a call that day, a call that would change everything. The call Claire received was the same one that had haunted her for years. The hoarse, drawling voice she knew too well. "Hi, Claire, I missed you." She had answered the phone thinking it was Alexander, but when she heard that voice, her legs weakened. She had to lean on the kitchen table to avoid falling. "What do you want?" she managed to whisper. "You know what I want," said the man. "You've always known. I need you to be a good girl and forget certain things from the past. There are people trying to dig into matters that have already been resolved." Claire closed her eyes, trying to control the trembling that took over her body. "I didn't talk to anyone. I never did." "I know, sweetheart. You've always been smart. But it seems someone is trying to convince you otherwise. Someone is filling your head with dangerous ideas about justice." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Claire, but her voice came out too weak to sound convincing. "Of course you do. That case that was archived 10 years ago. Certain people want to reopen it. They want you to testify. They want you to tell lies about me." Claire felt nauseous. They weren't lies. "Yes, they were," he said, and now there was a clear threat in his voice. "And if you try to tell those lies again, everyone will know about your little boyfriend, about how he's playing with you, lying to you, using you like a toy." "What are you talking about?" asked Claire, but something cold settled in her stomach. "Alexander Raven, sweetheart. Or do you prefer to call him Alexander Smith? Oh, you didn't know he has 2 names? 2 apartments? 2 lives? Claire sat heavily in the chair. You're lying. He owns Raven Tech, Claire, multi-millionaire, lives in a mansion in Greenwich, and created a false identity to play with you, to see if you're good enough for him. The words fell like hammers on Claire's head. She thought of all the times Alexander had seemed different, all the inconsistencies she had noticed but chosen to ignore. She thought about the way he sometimes spoke, as if he were from another world, how his hands were too soft for someone who worked with computers. You're lying, she repeated, but now without conviction. I have photos, Claire. I have proof. Want me to send them to you? Or would you prefer to find out for yourself? Claire hung up the phone without answering, but her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold it. She ran to the computer and typed Alexander Raven into Google. The first photo that appeared was of him at a business event, wearing an expensive suit surrounded by important people. It was her Alexander, but at the same time it wasn't. She spent the next few hours browsing the internet, discovering about his life, about his wealth, about his family. There were photos of him at gala dinners, on international trips, in luxurious penthouses. There were articles about his company, about his investments, about his carefully protected personal life. When Alexander arrived that night, Claire was sitting on the sofa, with the laptop open in front of her. She didn't get up to greet him, didn't smile, didn't ask about his day. She just looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger. "Claire," he said, realizing something was wrong. "Are you okay?" "Who are you?" she asked, her voice firm despite the pain she felt. Alexander felt the world crumble. "I'm Alexander, you know me." "Do I?" Claire turned the laptop to him. On the screen a photo of him inaugurating a business building. "Because this person looks very much like you, but his name is Alexander Raven, not Smith." Alexander closed. His eyes, knowing the moment he had so feared, had arrived. "Claire, I can explain." "Can you?" She stood up, and Alexander saw she was trembling with anger. "Can you explain how you lied to me for months? How you created a false identity? How you used me for some sick game?" "It wasn't a game," he said, approaching, but Claire backed away. "I fell in love with you. Everything I felt was real." "Real?" Claire laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "What was real, Alexander? Your name? Your profession? Your life? Or do you think love can be built on lies?" "I wanted to tell you," he said, desperate. "Every day I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid of losing you. So you preferred to use me as a guinea pig in your psychological experiment." The words came out like poison. "You wanted to see if the poor little girl would be capable of loving the powerful rich man without knowing who he was." Alexander felt that each of her words was a blade cutting his soul. "It wasn't like that." "It was exactly like that," said Claire, and now tears were running down her face. "You did to me the same thing he did. You used me, manipulated me, made me believe I was loved when, in reality, I was just an object." "Who is he?" asked Alexander, but Claire just shook her head. "Get out of here," she said, pointing to the door. "Get out of my house and my life." "Claire, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," she said, and the coldness in her voice was more painful than any shout. "You got what you wanted. Congratulations. The poor girl fell in love with the disguised prince. It must be very satisfying for your ego." Alexander tried to approach again, but Claire picked up a knife from the kitchen and pointed it at him. "I said get out." "You don't understand," he said, seeing the desperation in her eyes. "Someone found out about us. Someone is trying to use us. There are people trying to make you be quiet about what happened in the past." Claire lowered the knife, but her face remained hard. "You knew? You knew about him?" "No," said Alexander, being honest. "I only found out today. They blackmailed me. Said they would expose our story if I didn't convince you to give up on a case." "What case?" asked Claire, confused. "I don't know," admitted Alexander. "But whoever it is, they know about us. They know I'm pretending to be someone else." Claire sat down again as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "So you're not just a liar," she said. "You're also a coward. who bends to blackmail. I didn't bend, said Alexander. I told them to go to hell. How heroic, said Claire sarcastically. How noble of you to defend me after using me for months. Alexander knelt in front of her. Claire, I love you. I truly love you. Everything that happened between us was real. It was real for me, she said, and the pain in her voice was unbearable. But for you it was just an experiment, a test to see if I passed the exam. It wasn't like that. Yes, it was, said Claire, standing up again. And you know what's worse? I always knew. From the first day I knew you were Alexander Raven. I knew and chose to pretend I didn't know. Alexander felt as if he had been punched. You knew? I'm not an idiot, she said. I recognized you the first time we met at the program, but when you showed up pretending to be someone else, I thought maybe you were doing it out of love. That maybe you wanted to get to know me without all the barriers of money and power. Alexander tried to process what he was hearing. You knew and still... I still fell in love with Alexander Smith, she said. With the version of you that was kind, honest, vulnerable. With the version that existed just for me. That version was real, said Alexander. I was never more myself than when I was with you. No, said Claire, shaking her head. That version was a lie, and I was stupid enough to believe you could truly love me. Claire grabbed a small suitcase and began throwing clothes into it. I'm leaving, she said. I'm going to disappear before your story comes out in the newspapers and turns me into a national joke. Don't go, begged Alexander. We can solve this. We can fight these people together. Claire stopped packing and looked at him. Together, she said. Do you really think we still have anything together after all this? Alexander saw that he had lost. He saw that no matter how much he explained, how much he begged, Claire would never trust him again. The test he had created to make sure of her love had become the very destruction of that love. I'm sorry, he said, and it was all he could offer. So am I, said Claire, and for the first time since he had arrived, her voice softened. I'm sorry for believing you could be different from the others. She finished packing and walked toward the door. Claire, said Alexander one last time. She stopped but didn't turn around. Tell your people they won, she said. I won't testify against anyone. I'll disappear. I'll go far away from here and never bother you again. That's not what I want, said Alexander. It doesn't matter what you want anymore, said Claire. You made your choice when you decided to lie to me. And then she left, leaving Alexander alone in the apartment that had become the happiest place in his life and was now just a tomb of destroyed dreams. For 3 weeks, Alexander lived in the hell of his own creation. He looked for Claire in every possible place, but she had disappeared as if she had never existed. Her apartment was empty, rented to someone else. At the program, they said she had resigned, citing personal reasons. Not even her sister in Atlantic City knew where she was. Alexander mobilized all the resources he had, hired the best investigators, used all his contacts. But Claire had become a ghost. It was as if she had learned to hide from powerful people, as if she already knew how to disappear when necessary. During these weeks, the scandal he had so feared didn't happen. Dr. Henry Morgan didn't return. There was no blackmail, no threats. The silence was almost worse than any threat, because it meant Claire had kept her word. She had given up fighting, had chosen to disappear rather than face the past. Alexander returned to the mansion in Greenwich, but the luxurious house seemed emptier than ever. Each room echoed with Claire's absence. Each solitary meal was a reminder of what he had lost. He tried to return to his work routine, but couldn't concentrate. In meetings, his mind wandered, remembering her laugh, the way she read poetry, how her eyes shone when she talked about her students. One night, while drinking alone in his office, Alexander found the courage to do something he had been postponing. He called the investigator he had used to discover about Claire at the beginning of everything. I need you to find someone, he said, his voice hoarse from whiskey and despair. A woman named Claire Sanders. She disappeared and I need to know where she is. Mr. Raven, said the investigator, hesitant. May I ask why you need to find her? Because I love her, said Alexander, and it was the first time he had admitted this to another person. And because I made the biggest mistake of my life. The investigator worked for a week before calling with news. Mr. Raven, I found a trail. She was using her mother's maiden name, working as a private tutor in the Hudson Valley. But what? Asked Alexander, his heart racing. She's not there anymore. According to the neighbors, she left 3 days ago. She was very thin, seemed sick. They said she cried a lot. Alexander felt a physical pain in his chest. Any idea where she went? No, sir, but I can keep looking. Keep looking, said Alexander, no matter the cost. 2 days later, the investigator called again. Mr. Raven, I need you to come here. I have information I can't give over the phone. Alexander drove to the investigator's office with his heart beating erratically. The man was serious, with an expression Alexander couldn't interpret. I found Claire Sanders, he said. She's hospitalized at Mount Sinai in Manhattan. Alexander felt the world spin. What happened? Suicide attempt, said the investigator, and Alexander felt as if he had been shot. She took an overdose of medication. She's been hospitalized for 2 days. Alexander rushed to the hospital as if his life depended on it. When he reached the room, he found Claire unconscious, connected to machines, pale as a ghost. There was a nurse in the room who looked at him with curiosity. Are you family? She asked. I'm her boyfriend, said Alexander, and the word came out strange, inadequate to describe what they had had. She can't receive visitors yet, said the nurse, only family. Alexander wanted to shout that he was more family to Claire than anyone in the world, but knew he had no right to that. When will she wake up? We don't know, said the nurse. She took a very high dose. We were lucky to find her in time. Alexander spent the night at the hospital, sitting in the waiting room, looking through the door of the room. He saw doctors coming and going, saw nurses checking the machines, saw Claire's sister arrive from Atlantic City, crying. When Claire's sister saw him, her eyes filled with anger. You, she said, approaching. You're responsible for this. I know, said Alexander, and didn't try to defend himself. I know it's my fault. She called me before taking the pills, said the sister, tears running down her face. Said she couldn't bear living knowing she would never be truly loved. Said she would always be just an object to men. Each word was a blade cutting Alexander's soul. Will she be okay? Physically, yes, said the sister. Emotionally, I don't know. She had already been through so much. This was the final blow. Alexander stayed at the hospital for 3 days, waiting for Claire to wake up. When she finally opened her eyes, she was alone with her sister. Alexander observed from a distance through the door and saw that she was different. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a resignation that frightened him. That night, Alexander managed to enter the room when Claire was alone. She was awake, staring at the ceiling, and when she saw him, she showed no surprise. Why did you come here? She asked, her voice weak but firm. To make sure your experiment worked? I came because I love you, said Alexander, approaching the bed. I came because I can't live without you. Funny, said Claire, and there was bitterness in her voice. I tried to die because I thought I couldn't live without you. It seems we're both idiots. Alexander knelt beside the bed. Claire, forgive me. I know I don't deserve it, but please, forgive me. Forgive what? She asked, finally looking at him. The lie? The manipulation? Or the fact that you made me believe I could be loved? You are loved, said Alexander, holding her hand. I love you more than I've loved anything in my life. You love the idea of me, said Claire. You love the version of me that worked in your experiment, but you don't really know me. Then let me get to know you, begged Alexander. Let me truly love you with all your secrets, all your scars. Claire looked at him for a long moment. You know what's the worst of all, she said. I still love you. Even after everything, even knowing you lied, I still love you. And that's killing me. Then why can't we try? Asked Alexander. Why can't we start over, this time without lies? Because it doesn't work that way, said Claire. You don't build love on lies. You don't build trust on betrayal. You showed me that even Men who seem good are capable of using me. I didn't want to use you, said Alexander. I fell in love with you. After testing me, said Claire, after deciding I was good enough for you, as if I were a product you were buying. Alexander knew she was right. He knew he had turned love into a transaction, had treated Claire as if she were a commodity that needed to be evaluated before purchase. I was a coward, he admitted. I was afraid of falling in love and being abandoned like my father was, so I created an impossible test. And I failed the test, said Claire, because I fell in love with someone who didn't exist. I do exist, said Alexander. Everything you loved about me was real. Only the name and profession were false. Claire shook her head. It wasn't just the name, it was the honesty. It was the trust. It was the certainty that you loved me for who I was, not for how I behaved. Alexander felt he was losing her again. What can I do, he asked. What can I do for you to forgive me? Claire closed her eyes, and Alexander saw tears rolling down her face. You can let me go, she said. You can let me try to rebuild my life away from you. I can't, said Alexander. I can't live without you. Then we'll both have to learn, said Claire, opening her eyes, because I can't live like this anymore. I can't be the object of powerful men's games anymore. Alexander remained by the bed for a few more minutes, holding Claire's hand, knowing it might be the last time. When he stood to leave, she called him. Alexander, she said, thank you for having loved me, even if it was in your twisted way. I will always love you, he said. No matter where you are, no matter what happens, I will always love you. Claire smiled, a sad smile that broke his heart. I know, she said. I will always love you too. But sometimes love isn't enough. Alexander left the hospital knowing he had lost the only person who really mattered. But he also knew he wouldn't give up. He would find a way to prove to Claire that he had changed, that he had learned, that he was capable of loving her the way she deserved to be loved. 6 months passed since Alexander left the hospital. 6 months in which he changed more than he had changed in his entire life. He sold the mansion in Greenwich and moved to a simple apartment in Brooklyn, near the place where he had been happy with Claire. Not out of strategy, but because it was the only place in New York where he felt at home. He drastically reduced his participation in the company, delegating most of the responsibilities to his team. He kept just enough to live comfortably, but without ostentation. He discovered he needed much less money than he imagined to be happy, and that loneliness in a small apartment was less suffocating than loneliness in a palace. More importantly, he began working as a volunteer at the same college prep program where he had met Claire. He taught computer science for free twice a week to young people who dreamed of a better future. At first it was strange. The students viewed him with suspicion, knowing who he was, but gradually they accepted his presence. Alexander discovered he enjoyed teaching. He liked seeing the sparkle in the young people's eyes when they understood a new concept, liked being part of something bigger than his own success. It was as if he had finally found a purpose that made sense. During these months, he discreetly looked for Claire without harassing her, just to know if she was okay. He learned she had returned to live in Atlantic City, at her sister's house, and that she was in therapy. He didn't try to contact her, respecting the space she had asked for, but kept informed through mutual acquaintances. On a Thursday afternoon, while teaching at the program, Alexander saw a familiar figure at the door of the classroom. It was the director, but she wasn't alone. Beside her, wearing a simple dress and her hair tied in a bun, was Claire. Alexander felt his heart stop. She was thinner, more serious, but still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Their eyes met for a moment, and he saw she was nervous but determined. "Everyone," said Alexander to the students, trying to keep his voice steady, "keep practicing the exercise. I'll be right back." He left the room and found Claire in the hallway. She was standing, looking at him as if she were seeing a ghost. "Hi," she said, and her voice was firmer than he expected. "Hi," Alexander replied, not knowing what else to say. "Are you okay?" "I'm better," said Claire. "In therapy, working in Atlantic City, living." "I'm glad," said Alexander, and it was true. "Are you coming back to work here?" "I'm not sure yet," said Claire. "I came to talk to the director about other possibility, but first I wanted to talk to you." Alexander felt a mixture of hope and fear. "About what?" "About us," said Claire. "About what happened. About what I learned in these months." They went out to the program's courtyard where some trees offered shade. Claire sat on a bench and Alexander sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I did a lot of therapy," Claire began. "I talked about you, about us, about everything that happened, and I understood some things." "What things?" asked Alexander, trying to read her expression. "That you weren't the only one who was afraid," said Claire, "that I was also running from the truth, that I pretended not to know who you were because it was easier than facing the fact that a man like you might be interested in me." Alexander remained silent, letting her continue. "You tested me," said Claire, "but I also tested you. I tested to see if you would be capable of loving me without knowing that I knew, if you would be capable of being vulnerable with me." "Claire." "Let me finish," she said. "We were both afraid. You of being abandoned like your father was. Me of being used as I always was. So we created a relationship based on mutual lies, and when the truth came out, everything collapsed." Alexander nodded, understanding where she was going. "The difference," continued Claire, "is that your lies were about who you were. Mine were about what I knew. You lied about your identity. I lied about my ignorance." "Do you think we can forgive each other?" asked Alexander. Claire looked him in the eyes. "I've already forgiven you," she said. "I forgave you because I understood you were as hurt as I was, that you did what you did because you were afraid of suffering." Alexander felt tears burn his eyes. "I forgive you too," he said. "I understand you. I understand why you pretended, why you protected yourself." "The question isn't forgiveness," said Claire. "The question is whether we're capable of building something real from now on, something based on total honesty." "Do you want to try?" asked Alexander, hardly daring to hope. "I do," said Claire, "but with conditions. No lies, no games, no tests. If we're going to do this, we'll do it with the truth, even if it's painful." Alexander nodded vigorously. "Anything, I accept any condition." "First condition," said Claire. "I want to know the real Alexander. Not the businessman, not the poor man, but who you really are. Your qualities and your flaws, your fears and your dreams." "You will know," promised Alexander, "all of me." "Second condition," continued Claire. "I will tell you everything about me, about my past, about my traumas, about my son. I won't hide anything anymore." "I want to know everything," said Alexander. "I want to know every part of you." "Third condition," said Claire, and her voice became more serious. "We go slowly. We don't pretend we can pick up where we left off. We start from zero. Build slowly with trust." "Slowly," agreed Alexander, "for as long as you need." Claire smiled for the first time, a small but genuine smile. "Then maybe we can try," she said. Alexander wanted to hug her, kiss her, but respected the space she had asked for. Instead, he extended his hand. "Hi," he said. "I'm Alexander Raven, businessman, son of troubled parents, man who made terrible mistakes because he was afraid to love." Claire took his hand and shook it. "Hi," she said. "I'm Claire. Claire Sanders, teacher, mother of a boy who doesn't know me, woman who almost gave up living because she thought she didn't deserve to be loved." "Pleasure to truly meet you, Claire Sanders," said Alexander. "Pleasure to truly meet you, Alexander Raven," replied Claire. During the months that followed, they got to know each other again. This time without masks, without pretense, without fear. Alexander told about his lonely childhood, about the pressure of managing an empire, about his fears and insecurities. Claire told about the rape, about the pain of having a son she couldn't raise, about the years of therapy to rebuild her self-esteem. They were difficult months, full of painful conversations and tears. But they were also months of healing, of discovery, of love growing on. Solid foundations. Alexander helped Claire legally prosecute her aggressor, using his resources not to protect himself, but to give her the justice that had been denied. Claire helped Alexander reconnect with his humanity, find purpose beyond financial success. On a winter night, a year after their reunion, Claire and Alexander were walking through the park where they had talked so many times. She wore a coat he had given her, and he held her hand as one holds something precious. "You know I love you, don't you?" said Alexander, stopping under a tree. "I know," said Claire, smiling. "I love you too. For real this time." "Will you marry me?" asked Alexander. "Not for a test, not for proof, but because I want to spend the rest of my life loving you." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "But first, I want you to meet my son. I want him to know the man who will be my husband." They were married 6 months later, in a simple ceremony, surrounded only by the people who really mattered. Claire's son was there, an 11-year-old boy who had just discovered that Claire was his biological mother and who had accepted Alexander as his stepfather. At the altar, when they exchanged vows, Alexander looked into Claire's eyes and said, "I promise to love you without tests, without games, without fear. I promise that our truth will be stronger than any lie." Claire responded, "I promise to trust you, in us, in our love. I promise I won't run anymore when things get difficult." When they kissed, sealing the promise, Alexander thought about his father's note that he had carried for so long. He finally understood that his father was wrong. Love did exist, but it wasn't possession or power. It was choice, courage, and daily work. 5 years later, Alexander and Claire had a daughter and lived in a simple but love-filled house. He continued working at the company, but dedicated more time to family and social projects. Claire had returned to teaching, but now also wrote books about overcoming adversity. Sometimes, when Alexander saw Claire reading to their daughter, or when she smiled at him in the morning, he remembered how foolish he had been to try to test her. Love didn't need proof. It only needed the courage to be lived every day, with truth, with patience, with the certainty that some things in life are worth any risk. And Claire, holding his hand while they watched their children play in the garden, knew it had been worth fighting for, that it had been worth believing that true love existed